This is a story for the man who stands guard, not with a sword, but with a steady hand offered when you least expect it. It is for the woman who learns that safety is not a place, but the quiet promise in a pair of watchful eyes. It is not a tale of thunder and lightning, but of the slow, certain dawn that breaks between two people who choose, in the hushed lamplight of a lonely kitchen, to belong to each other. The silence in Elias Thorne's house had a weight to it. It settled on the floorboards he'd planed himself, clung to the woolen blankets folded at the foot of his bed, a bed made for one, and filled the space beside him at the long, empty supper table. For 5 years, since he'd driven the last nail into the roof of his modest ranch house, this quiet had been his only constant companion. His life was a testament to order, a bulwark against the chaos he'd known before. The tools in the barn hung in their precise places, the firewood was stacked just so, and the sun rose and set on a rhythm of solitary labor. He was a man who spoke little and listened closely, his stillness a form of vigilance. But as dusk bled across the prairie, casting long shadows that reached for him like grasping fingers, the order he'd built felt less like a fortress and more like a cage. The flickering lamplight on a single plate only underscored the hollowness of the room, the profound and aching absence of a shared breath in the quiet. He needed a cook. The advertisement he'd placed in the Territorial Gazette was a matter of practicality, nothing more. He was a rancher, not a chef, and his own cooking was a bland, repetitive affair of salt pork and beans. He expected a wiry widow, perhaps, or a stern woman of middle years. He did not expect Eleanor Vance. When she stepped down from the mail coach, the driver handing down a single sturdy trunk, Elias felt a current of surprise that was sharp enough to be uncomfortable. She was not a small woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with a presence that seemed to take up more space than she physically occupied. She moved with a deliberation that spoke of strength, not fragility. Her dress was clean but worn, the fabric thinned at the elbows, and her hands, when she removed her gloves, were capable and bare. There was a pride in the set of her jaw and a directness in her gaze that met his without flinching. "Mr. Thorne?" she asked, her voice a low contralto, steady and clear. He gave a curt nod, his own voice rusty from disuse. "Ma'am." He took her trunk, the weight of it solid in his grip, and led the way to the house. The door opened into the main room, which served as kitchen, dining hall, and living space. A stone hearth dominated one wall, cold and empty. "The kitchen," he said, gesturing with his chin. It was an unnecessary statement. She saw it all: the neatly swept floor, the scrubbed table, the single chair. Her gaze lingered on that solitary chair before returning to his face. A flicker of something understanding perhaps passed through her eyes. "It is orderly," she said. It was not a compliment, merely an observation. Elias felt an unaccustomed need to explain the starkness of his life. "I require a cook, room and board, and a wage. The work is honest." Eleanor set her small reticule on the table, the sound unnervingly loud in the stillness. "And the woman who takes the position? Where does she sleep?" she asked, her question practical, yet it hung in the air with a deeper resonance. He had not thought it through with the detail it deserved. He'd built the house for himself, a fortress of solitude. There was only his room and a small, unfinished attic space meant for storage. A flush of heat crept up his neck. "There's a cot." "In the attic," he said, the words sounding inadequate as soon as they left his lips. She looked toward the ceiling, then back at him, her expression unreadable. "Show me," she said. It was not a request, but a quiet command, and for the first time in 5 years, Elias Thorne was not the sole authority within his own 4 walls. The first flicker of warmth in the house was not from the hearth, but from the unsettling, intriguing presence of a woman who met his silence with her own steady calm. The attic was as he had described it, small, unfinished, and dominated by the slope of the roof. A narrow cot was pushed against the far wall, a thin mattress, and a single blanket folded upon it. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light from a small, grimy window. Eleanor Vance stood in the center of the space, her hands clasped loosely before her, her posture erect. She did not complain. She did not bargain. She simply observed, her perceptive gaze taking in the bare rafters, the chill in the air, the profound lack of comfort. Elias stood in the doorway, the space suddenly feeling crowded, intimate in a way that set his teeth on edge. He was a large man, but she seemed to fill the room with a different kind of presence, one that was not about size, but about an unyielding sense of self. "The roof does not leak," he stated, the words sounding hollow and defensive. Eleanor ran a hand along the rough-hewn wood of a support beam. "That is a fine quality in a roof," she replied, her tone even. She turned to face him, her eyes holding his. "Mr. Thorne, your advertisement was for a cook. This arrangement implies I will be living under your roof in your house, alone with you." He had known this, of course. He had simply not considered the implications from any perspective but his own. He was an honorable man. His own conduct was not in question. But her world, he was suddenly starkly aware, was different from his. "I am an honorable man," he said, the declaration feeling clumsy. A faint, sad smile touched her lips. Many men claim the same. Honor is not a title, but an action, repeated daily. She looked from him to the cot, and a decision settled in her features. "I will take the position. My duties are to cook 3 meals a day and keep the kitchen clean. Is that correct?" He nodded, relieved and yet strangely unsettled. "And my time, after my work is done, is my own?" She pressed. "Yes. My door, if I am to have one, will have a lock?" It was a direct challenge to his stated honor, yet he felt no anger, only a dawning respect. The attic had no door, only an opening at the top of a steep ladder. He saw the problem instantly. It was a problem he had created. "There is no door," he admitted, "but there will be. And it will have a lock. I will see to it tomorrow." She gave a single slow nod. "Then I accept. I will begin with supper." The descent down the ladder was a careful, deliberate affair. In the main room, she untied her bonnet, her movements economical and precise. She surveyed the kitchen, his kitchen, with a proprietor's eye, touching the handle of the cast-iron skillet, checking the level of flour in the bin. Elias felt like a stranger in his own home. He had wanted a cook, a functionary to fill a need. He had hired a presence, a quiet force that was already changing the very air he breathed. That evening, for the first time in 5 years, the house was filled with the scent of roasting chicken and onions. Elias sat at one end of the long table, and Eleanor sat at the other, the distance between them a vast, uncharted territory. The silence was different now. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the soft clink of cutlery against a plate, the sound of another person's breathing. He watched her as she ate, her focus on her meal. She was not cowed by his stoicism or the starkness of the home. When their eyes met across the table, she did not look away. "The meal is satisfactory?" she asked. "It is," he said, and it was more than satisfactory. It was nourishment, but it was also something else, a beginning. After she had cleared the table and washed the dishes, she stopped before the ladder to the attic. "Mr. Thorne," she said, her back to him, "the door." "I will not forget," he promised. As she ascended into the darkness, he remained at the table, the warmth of the food a ghost in his belly. He was a protector by nature, a man whose moral code was etched as deeply as the lines on his face. He scanned his property for threats, his livestock for illness, the sky for storms. Now, for the first time, he found himself scanning the interior of his own home, and the only thing that felt remotely like a threat was the profound, unnerving hope stirring in his chest. The next morning, Elias built a door. He worked with the focused intensity he applied to all tasks, his hands sure and competent as he measured, sawed, and planed the pine boards. The sounds of his labor, the rasp of the saw, the rhythmic tap of the hammer filled the house, a stark contrast to the usual quiet. From the kitchen, Eleanor listened, the sounds of strange and reassuring percussion beneath the sizzle of bacon in the pan. She did not comment on his work, but when he came in for breakfast, his hands dusty with sawdust, she had set a basin of warm water and a clean cloth on a stool near the hearth. It was a simple gesture, an anticipation of a need he hadn't voiced, and it struck him with the force of a physical blow. He washed his hands, the warmth of the water a comfort, and was acutely aware of her presence as she moved about the kitchen, pouring coffee into 2 mugs that now sat side by side on the table. Trust, he was learning, was not built on grand pronouncements, but on the accumulation of small, quiet moments. A basin of water, a second mug of coffee. Their days fell into a new rhythm, an unspoken choreography of shared space. He would rise before dawn to see to the ranch, and she would already have the fire going, the scent of coffee, a welcome promise in the cool air. He would come in for meals, and the table would be set, the food simple but wholesome, prepared with a care that was entirely new to him. In the afternoons, as he mended tack or tallied figures in his ledger, she would be occupied with her own tasks, kneading bread, mending her worn clothing, or, as he discovered one afternoon, teaching herself to read from a small, battered primer she had brought in her trunk. He watched her from across the room, her brow furrowed in concentration as she traced the letters with her finger, her lips moving silently. He felt a protective urge so fierce it startled him. It was an impulse to shield her not from physical danger, but from the frustrations of her struggle. He walked over to the table, his shadow falling across her book. She looked up, her expression guarded. "That letter," he said, his voice low as he pointed a calloused finger at the page. "It makes the K sound. Like in kitchen." Her eyes widened slightly, a flicker of surprise. Before she nodded, a silent acknowledgment of his help. She did not thank him, but the next day she left a small bowl of wild berry jam beside his plate at breakfast. Their communication was a language of gestures. He took to leaving a bucket of fresh well water just inside the door for her each morning, saving her the trip. She, in turn, began mending his work shirts, the stitches small and neat, a silent reproach to his own clumsy repairs. One evening he came in soaked from a sudden summer downpour, chilled to the bone. As he stood dripping on the hearth, she approached him, not with a towel, but with a steaming mug of tea, sweetened with honey. "Drink this," she said, her voice soft. He took the mug, his cold fingers brushing against hers. The contact was brief, accidental, but a jolt of heat, entirely separate from the tea, shot up his arm. He saw her flinch, a barely perceptible recoil, and he immediately drew his hand back, a wave of self-reproach washing over him. "I'm sorry," he said, the words gruff. "I should have been more careful." Eleanor looked at his hand, then back to his face. "It was only a touch, Mr. Thorne." But it wasn't only a touch. It was a breach, a crossing of a line they hadn't known existed until that moment. A new tension entered the quiet house, a fragile, humming wire of awareness that stretched between them. He became meticulously careful, his movements deliberate as he navigated the shared space, always ensuring a respectable distance. But the guardedness was changing. It was no longer about maintaining solitude. It was about managing a burgeoning, terrifying longing. He found himself watching her hands as she kneaded dough, mesmerized by their strength and grace. He would catch the scent of lavender from her hair as she passed, and his breath would catch in his throat. The protector in him, the man who scanned for external threats, was now scanning her for signs of distress, for the subtle language of her comfort and discomfort. The service he offered, the locked door, the bucket of water, the help with a difficult word, was becoming his love language, the only one he knew how to speak. The summer heat settled over the prairie, thick and unyielding. The nights offered little relief, and the small attic room beneath the shingles became an oven. Elias, sleeping in his own room on the ground floor, could hear the restless creak of Eleanor's cot through the ceiling, the sound a constant, quiet testament to her discomfort. He lay awake for hours, the image of her in that stifling space pressing on him. It felt like a failure of his duty, a flaw in the sanctuary he was supposed to provide. His honor, the code he lived by, demanded he do something. But every solution he could conjure felt like a transgression, a step across a boundary he had sworn to respect. He could not invite her into his room. The impropriety was unthinkable. But he could not leave her to suffer in the heat he had inadvertently condemned her to. After 3 nights of this, his own sleep broken and shallow, he made a decision. He found her the next morning by the well, drawing water. The sun was already a fierce weight in the sky. He waited until she had set the buckets down, giving her his full attention. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice rougher than he intended, "the heat in the attic is considerable." She looked up at him, her face already beaded with perspiration, and simply nodded. She would not complain. It was not in her nature. "It is not right," he continued, forcing the words out. "There is a space, here on the main floor, behind the pantry screen. It is cooler there. You could move your cot." He had rehearsed the words, wanting them to sound practical, detached. But in the charged space between them, they sounded like something more. An invitation. She watched him, her expression unreadable, weighing his offer. He saw the flicker of pride, the instinct to refuse, warring with the sheer, physical misery of her nights. "Why?" she asked, her voice quiet. He had not expected the question. The practical answer was the heat. But that wasn't the whole truth. "Because it is my responsibility to see you are safe and properly accommodated," he said, the word safe encompassing more than just physical comfort. It was about her well-being, a concept that had taken root and grown in his chest without his permission. She looked from his earnest face toward the house, then back again. Her gaze was searching, probing for the intent behind the offer. He held her stare, letting her see the truth of it. This was not a proposition, but a remedy. You would be sleeping nearby, she stated, not as a question, but as a fact that needed to be laid bare between them. "Yes," he said, "behind the screen. With your permission." The inclusion of those last 3 words was crucial. He was not telling her, he was asking. He was ceding the power of the decision to her, a gesture of respect more profound than any lock on a door. He watched as a slow, deliberate breath expanded her chest. She was choosing. He was not her protector in that moment, but a man making a request, and she, the survivor who had learned to guard her autonomy with fierce pride, was the one with the authority to grant it. Finally, she gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "If the cot will fit, and if the screen is sufficient." "It is," he said, a wave of relief so potent it almost buckled his knees. "I will move it for you." That evening, he carefully maneuvered her cot and small trunk into the alcove behind the folding screen that sectioned off a corner of the main room. It created a small, private chamber, shielded from direct view of his own sleeping area, which was little more than a bed on the other side of the stone hearth. The house, which had once felt so vast and empty, now seemed to shrink, the geography of their lives realigned into a new, startling proximity. That night, the silence was different yet again. It was not empty, nor was it merely occupied. It was shared. He lay on his bed, listening not to the creaks from the ceiling above, but to the soft sounds of her settling in behind the screen, just a few yards away. He heard the whisper of fabric as she prepared for bed, the soft sigh as she lay down. It was the most intimate thing he had ever experienced, this shared vulnerability in the dark. He was acutely aware of her presence, a warm, living entity in his solitary world. He did not feel the urge to guard against a threat from outside. Instead, he found himself standing guard over the fragile, precious peace that had settled within his own walls, a peace that had a name, and her name was Eleanor. The fragile domesticity Elias and Eleanor had built was tested by the arrival of Orrin Croft. He was a neighboring rancher, a man whose land bordered Elias's to the east, and he possessed an oily confidence that set Elias's teeth on edge. Croft had heard, through the insidious grapevine of frontier gossip, that Elias had hired a housekeeper. He arrived one afternoon unannounced, riding a fine horse and wearing clothes that were too clean for a working man. He dismounted and strode toward the house as if he owned it, his eyes scanning the property with a covetous air. Elias met him on the porch, his body a silent, solid barrier to the door. "Croft," he said, his voice flat. "Thorne," Croft replied with a wide, predatory smile. "Heard you finally decided to tame this place. Hired some help, did you?" Just then, Eleanor came to the doorway, wiping her hands on her apron, drawn by the sound of voices. Croft's gaze slid past Elias and fixed on her. His smile widened, becoming something uglier, more assessing. "Well now," he drawled, his eyes roaming over Eleanor in a way that was both an insult and a claim. "You've done better than just help, Thorne." Elias felt a cold, hard knot of fury tighten in his gut. He took a half step to his left, subtly repositioning himself to better shield Eleanor from Croft's view. It was an instinct, as natural as breathing. "Miss Vance is my cook," Elias stated, his tone leaving no room for misinterpretation. But Croft was not a man who respected boundaries. He tipped his hat to Eleanor, though the gesture was devoid of respect. "A pleasure, Miss Vance. A woman of your stature must have a healthy appetite for life. It's a shame to see it wasted in a place this quiet." The insinuation was plain. Eleanor's chin lifted, her gaze cool and direct. She did not cower or look to Elias for aid. She was a survivor, and her first line of defense was her own unshakable dignity. "I find the quiet suits me, Mr. Croft," she said, her voice even. Croft laughed, a harsh, unpleasant sound. "A woman says that when she hasn't had a better offer." He turned his attention back to Elias, though his words were clearly for Eleanor's benefit. "I'm having a barn raising next month. A dance, too. You should come, Thorne, and bring your cook. A woman needs a bit of society, a chance to be seen by men who can appreciate her." The man was a predator, marking his territory, and his words were a direct challenge to Elias's role as protector. The tension on the porch was thick enough to cut with a knife. Elias's hand twitched, the impulse to physically remove Croft a raw, primal urge. But he knew that would only escalate the situation, potentially putting Eleanor in more danger. Instead, he held his ground, his silence a more potent weapon than any threat. It was Eleanor who ended the confrontation. "Thank you for the invitation, Mr. Croft," she said, her tone perfectly polite, but leaving no doubt as to her meaning. "But I am not in need of society. My work here keeps me quite occupied." With a final dismissive nod, she stepped back inside the house, closing the door softly but firmly behind her. The click of the latch was a final, irrefutable statement. Croft was left staring at the closed door, his smirk faltering. He looked at Elias, a flicker of genuine anger in his eyes. "You do well to keep a shorter leash on that one, Thorne," he spat, before turning on his heel, mounting his horse, and riding away in a cloud of dust. Elias remained on the porch for a long moment, the fury slowly receding, replaced by a profound sense of pride in Eleanor's strength. When he finally went inside, he found her standing by the kitchen table, her hands gripping its edge, the knuckles white. The calm facade had crumbled, revealing the tremor of reaction beneath. He saw then that her courage was not the absence of fear, but the will to act in spite of it. He walked to the hearth and poured 2 cups of water from the bucket, his movements slow and deliberate. He brought one to her, holding it out. She looked up, her eyes dark with a history he did not know. "He is gone," Elias said softly. "You are safe here." She took the cup, her fingers brushing his. This time, neither of them pulled away. "Safety is a rare thing for a woman like me," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. The admission hung in the lamplight between them, an open door to a past filled with predators like Orrin Croft. "Tell me," he urged, his voice gentle. And in the quiet intimacy of the kitchen, with the threat of the outside world momentarily vanquished, she began to speak, sharing the story of how she came to be so strong, so resilient, and so very alone. The lamplight cast a warm, forgiving glow across the room, creating an island of intimacy in the vast, dark prairie. Eleanor spoke not of melodrama or peril, but of the quiet, grinding realities that had shaped her. She told of a feckless father who had left her family with nothing but debts, of years spent in thankless positions where her size and competence were exploited, and where men like Croft saw her not as a person, but as a prize to be claimed or a servant to be commanded. Her story was not one of helplessness, but of relentless perseverance. She spoke of learning to rely on her own judgment, of building walls not of stone, but of pride and perception, to protect the small, fiercely guarded space of her own autonomy. "I learned early," she said, her gaze fixed on the flickering flame of the lamp, "that a man's promise is worth less than the breath used to speak it. It is his actions, the small, consistent things, that reveal his character." Elias listened, his usual stillness deepening into a profound, empathetic silence. Every word she spoke resonated with his own unspoken history. He, too, was a survivor of a different kind. He had not faced her social perils, but he knew the sting of betrayal and the lonely burden of self-reliance. When she finished, a quiet settled between them, no longer tense, but filled with the weight of shared understanding. He felt an overwhelming urge to offer her comfort, but he knew that empty platitudes were not what she needed. She needed to see his character, not just hear of it. "My father," he began, his voice low and raspy, the words pulled from a place he kept locked away. "He was a man who took what he wanted. He saw strength as a weapon to be used against others. My mother, she learned to make herself small. I swore I would never be him." It was the most he had ever revealed of himself to anyone. A confession, a backstory, and a vow all in one. He was showing her the pieces of his past to prove the sincerity of his present. He was not his father. He was not Orrin Croft. He was a man who built doors and installed locks, who offered help with a difficult word, who stood as a shield on a porch. Eleanor looked at him then, truly looked at him, and in her eyes he saw not pity, but recognition. She saw the honorable man behind the stoic facade, the protector whose code was born from a painful legacy. The space between them, once measured in feet and propriety, now felt charged with a new, potent intimacy. The emotional doors had been thrown wide open. The shared confessions were a greater intimacy than any touch. He cleared his throat, the moment feeling pivotal, fragile. "Croft will likely be a problem," he stated, bringing the conversation back to the practical. "He is not a man to accept no gracefully." "I am aware," she said, her voice regaining its steady resolve. "This is your home, Elias," she continued, using his first name for the first time. The sound of it on her lips was a soft blow to his chest. "I am your employee. You are not obligated to put yourself at odds with your neighbors on my account." He met her gaze, his own unwavering. The choice was clear to him, had been from the moment Croft had looked at her with his predator's eyes. This was no longer about an employer and his cook. This was about a partnership, forged in shared silence, and now sealed in shared vulnerability. "This is my home," he agreed, his voice firm. "And in my home, you are not simply an employee. You are under my protection." The words felt inadequate. He wanted to say more, to give voice to the maelstrom of feeling in his chest, but the language of emotion was foreign to him. He could only speak the language he knew: action, service, and plain, simple vows. He reached across the table, not to touch her, but to lay his hand, palm up, on the wood between them. An offering. An invitation. It was a gesture of profound trust, returning the weapon hilt first. He was giving her his strength, not to wield over her, but to share with her. After a long moment, she lifted her own hand and placed it gently in his. Her touch was warm, her grip surprisingly strong. It was not a gesture of submission, but of alliance. In that moment, in the quiet lamplight, they chose each other. Not as lovers, not yet, but as partners. Two solitary souls forging a bond against a world that had taught them to expect the worst of it. The confrontation would come, but now they would face it together. The confrontation came not with fists or fury, but in the crowded, public space of the town's general store. A week after his visit, Orrin Croft, flanked by two of his hired hands, cornered Eleanor near the sacks of flour. Elias was across the room, negotiating the price of rock salt with the proprietor, but his attention, as always, was partially on her. He had seen Croft enter, and a cold, watchful stillness had settled over him. "Miss Vance," Croft began, his voice carrying an easy confidence that did not reach his eyes. "I was sorry to hear you won't be joining the festivities at my ranch. A party's no place for a woman to be alone, though. Allow me to escort you." He reached out, his hand moving to take her arm, a gesture of casual, entitled possession. It was the moment the entire store seemed to hold its breath to witness. Eleanor did not flinch. She did not retreat. She simply took one step back, just enough to cause his hand to fall short, her movement calm and deliberate. "Mr. Croft," she said, her voice clear and steady, audible to everyone in the suddenly silent store. "I believe I have already given you my answer." Croft's face tightened, a flash of anger in his eyes at being publicly rebuffed. "A woman doesn't always know what's best for her," he said, his voice lowering to a menacing purr. "Thorne can't offer you anything more than a cook's wages. A smart woman would consider a better prospect." He was turning it into a transaction, a public auction where she was the prize. Before Elias could cross the room, before he could utter a single word, he saw the subtle shift in Eleanor's posture. She was handling this. It was her battle to fight, and his role was not to rescue her, but to support her. Elias began to walk toward them, his steps measured, unhurried. He did not look at Croft. His eyes were on Eleanor. He stopped beside her, a silent, unshakable presence at her shoulder. He did not speak. He did not have to. His position was his statement. He was with her. They were a unit. The entire town was watching this quiet, domestic drama unfold. Croft, seeing Elias, sneered. "Finally come to collect your property, Thorne? Best teach her some manners." Elias ignored him completely. His focus remained on Eleanor. He met her eyes, a silent question passing between them. "Are you all right? What do you need?" Her gaze met his, and in that shared look, 1,000 words were exchanged. There was gratitude, trust, and a fierce, unyielding partnership. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "I am fine. I have this." Turning her attention back to Croft, her voice rang with a cold, clear finality that cut through the tension. "My arrangement with Mr. Thorne is my own affair. It is not a prospect to be bettered, and I am not a piece of property to be collected. Now, if you will excuse me, I have flour to purchase." She then did the simplest, most powerful thing she could. She turned her back on Orrin Croft and addressed the store owner. "A 20-pound sack, if you please, Mr. Henderson." The dismissal was absolute. Croft stood there, his bluff called, his entitlement laid bare and found wanting. He was exposed not by a threat of violence, but by the quiet dignity of a woman who refused to be intimidated and the silent solidarity of the man who stood with her. Humiliated, his face a mask of rage, Croft spun on his heel and stormed out of the store, his men trailing awkwardly behind him. The collective breath of the onlookers was released. The tension broke. Elias placed the payment for the flour and the salt on the counter. He then turned to Eleanor, in a gesture so simple and so public it was more intimate than a kiss. He took the heavy sack of flour from her before she could lift it. "I will carry this," he said, his voice a low rumble meant only for her. It was a plain vow, a public declaration. They were partners. He would carry her burdens. As they walked out of the store and into the sunlight, he did not take her arm. He did not walk ahead of her. He walked beside her, matching his stride to hers. They had faced their first test, not with a dramatic showdown, but with eye contact, wordless signals, and the unshakable power of a choice made together. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the air between them thick with the unspoken aftermath of the confrontation. The shared victory in the store had forged something new between them, something stronger and more definite. When they arrived, Elias carried the supplies into the kitchen, setting the flour sack down with a soft thud. He turned to find Eleanor standing by the table, her hands twisting a loose thread on her apron. The adrenaline had faded, leaving a faint tremor in its wake. He saw it, the subtle sign of the toll the encounter had taken on her hard-won composure. His instinct, the one he had honed over years of solitude, was to give her space, to retreat to the silence of his barn. But the man he was becoming, the partner he had chosen to be, knew that this moment called for something else. It called for care. He noticed a small, angry red scratch on the back of her hand, an injury she must have gotten when she'd stepped back from Croft, scraping it against a rough-hewn shelf. It was a minor wound, insignificant. But to him, it was a symbol of the hurt the world had tried to inflict upon her. "Your hand," he said, his voice softer than he'd ever heard it. She looked down, surprised, as if noticing the scratch for the first time. "It's nothing." "Let me see to it," he said. It was not a question. He went to the small cupboard where he kept a tin of salve and clean linen for injuries, his own or his animals'. He brought them to the table, along with the basin of water she had once set out for him. He gestured to the chair. "Sit." For a moment, he saw the flicker of her fierce independence, the instinct to refuse aid. But then she looked at his face, at the earnest, solemn concern in his eyes, and she slowly sat down. He drew up the other chair, the space between their knees brushing, a contact that was electric in its novelty. He gently took her hand in his. Her skin was warm, her bones delicate beneath his calloused, rough fingers. He held her wrist, his thumb resting on her pulse point, feeling the steady, rhythmic beat of her life, a silent reassurance. With painstaking care, he cleaned the small wound, his touch as tender as he could make it. She watched him, her breath catching softly as he applied the cool salve. He worked in silence, his entire focus on this small act of tending. It was aftercare, a quiet mending of a hurt that went deeper than the skin. It was his way of saying, "I will care for your wounds. I will protect you from the aftermath. I will be your peace." When he was finished, he wrapped a thin strip of clean linen around her hand, his fingers moving with a surprising deftness. He did not release her hand immediately. He simply held it, his large, scarred hand cradling hers. The kitchen was hushed, the only sound the ticking of the mantel clock he'd inherited from his mother. The lamplight softened the hard lines of his face, revealing the deep well of tenderness he kept so carefully guarded. He finally met her eyes. The yearning that had been a low hum beneath the surface of their lives was now a palpable presence in the room. He saw it reflected in her gaze, a mirror of the longing in his own soul. "Eleanor," he whispered, her name a prayer on his lips. She leaned forward, a small, almost imperceptible movement, and rested her forehead against his. The contact was breathtaking. He could feel the soft whisper of her breath against his cheek, could smell the scent of lavender and freshly baked bread that clung to her. They stayed like that for a long moment, two solitudes touching, finding refuge in one another. It was a moment of profound, wordless communication. It was not about desire, not yet. It was about solace. It was about the quiet, powerful intimacy of being cared for, of being seen. When he finally drew back, he fed her. He sliced bread and cheese and poured 2 glasses of milk, and they ate there, in the quiet glow of the lamp, the simple meal a sacrament. He was washing the ink of the world's ugliness from her hands, and in doing so, he was washing away his own loneliness. In the days that followed, the very atmosphere of the house changed. The unspoken tension of 2 strangers navigating a shared space had dissolved, replaced by the quiet, humming warmth of a bond acknowledged. Their movements were no longer a careful choreography of avoidance, but a comfortable, familiar dance. He would enter the kitchen and find she had already poured his coffee, leaving it on the edge of the table nearest his chair. She would look up from her sewing and find he had left a newly sharpened knife for her vegetables, the handle turned toward her, an offering. They spoke more, their conversations no longer limited to the practicalities of the household. He told her about his plans for the ranch, the bloodline of his cattle, his dream of one day breeding horses. She, in turn, shared her knowledge of herbs and gardening, her quiet observations of the changing seasons. They were building a life together, not in grand declarations, but in the small daily accretion of shared thoughts and duties. One evening he was in the barn, repairing a broken latch on a stall door by the light of a lantern. He was so absorbed in his work that he didn't hear her approach until she was standing just inside the wide doorway, a silhouette against the deep indigo of the twilight sky. She was holding his mended shirt, the one with the torn sleeve. He had given it to her without a word, and she had taken it with a simple nod. Now she held it out to him. The seam was perfect, the stitches so fine as to be nearly invisible. It was more than a repair. It was a restoration. It was a symbol of what she was doing for him, for his life. She was mending the torn places, stitching his lonely existence back into something whole. "I finished it," she said softly. He put down his tools and wiped his hands on his trousers, walking toward her. He took the shirt, the fabric still warm from her hands. "Thank you," he said, the words feeling utterly inadequate for the depth of gratitude he felt. This small repaired piece of clothing felt like the most precious gift he had ever received. He looked from the shirt to her face, bathed in the golden lantern light. He saw the strength there, the resilience, but he also saw a softness, a vulnerability she only ever allowed him to see. The desire he had kept so carefully banked within him rose, hot and insistent. It was not the predatory urge of a man like Croft. It was a deep, reverent longing to cherish, to honor, to be close. He wanted to touch her, to trace the line of her jaw, to feel the weight of her hand in his once more. But he would not unless she invited him to. "Eleanor," he began, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. "This arrangement, it is no longer just about a cook's wages and a place to sleep. Not for me." She met his gaze, her own eyes dark and serious. "I know," she whispered. He took a breath, summoning the courage for the most important question he would ever ask. "I want you to stay, not as my cook, not as my employee." He paused, searching for the right words, the plain speech that could hold the immensity of his feelings. "I want you to stay as my partner, to build a life here, with me, if you want." He did not touch her. He did not move closer. He stood before her, his heart laid bare, giving her all the power, all the agency. The choice had to be hers, freely and completely. This was not an obligation born of her circumstances. It was an invitation to a shared future. She looked around the barn, at the clean-swept floor, the orderly tools, the gentle beasts shifting in their stalls. She looked at the house beyond, a place she had transformed from a hollow shell into a home. Then her eyes returned to his, and for the first time since he had met her, he saw an unguarded, radiant smile spread across her face. It was like the sun breaking through a lifetime of clouds. "Yes, Elias," she said, her voice full of a hope that matched his own. "Yes, I will stay." He felt the word resonate through him, a deep, grounding tremor of pure joy. He had offered her a home, and in her acceptance, he had finally, truly found his own. Her yes did not unleash a torrent of passion. It settled between them like a soft, warm blanket, a promise of comfort and shared warmth for all the nights to come. The intimacy that followed was not a storm, but a quiet, deepening river. It began, as so many things between them did, with a simple, practical need that blossomed into something more. The first chill of autumn had crept into the air, and the single blanket on her cot behind the screen was no longer enough. Elias, ever watchful, noticed her shivering slightly one morning as she stoked the fire. That evening he approached her, his demeanor as serious as if he were discussing a deed of land. "The nights are getting colder," he stated. She nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "It is not right for you to be cold," he continued. He looked toward his own bed, a large, sturdy frame he had built himself, piled with thick wool blankets and a patchwork quilt his mother had made. "My bed is large enough, and warm. There would be space between us." It was a shocking, scandalous proposal by the world's standards, but in the private world they had built, it was an offer of care. He was inviting her to share his warmth, his most personal space, but he was also laying out the boundaries before she could even ask. "Only if you want," he added, his voice low and earnest. "You would be safe." She looked at the bed, then at him. She saw no hint of coercion in his eyes, only a deep, abiding concern. He was not asking for her body. He was offering to keep her warm. Her trust in him was absolute, built piece by piece through every locked door, every basin of warm water, every moment he had stood by her side. "Yes," she said softly, "I would like that." The first time she slept in his bed, they were like two separate islands in a vast sea of mattress. He lay stiffly on his side, his back to her, every muscle tensed. He gave her the warmer side, the one closer to the banked hearth. He could feel the heat of her body across the space between them, could hear the soft sound of her breathing. It was a sweet agony, a test of his control. But as the nights passed, the space began to shrink. One night, her foot brushed against his in sleep. Another time, he awoke to find she had curled toward him in the night, her hand resting on the mattress near his shoulder. Each small, unconscious touch was a revelation. Their first deliberate kiss happened in the kitchen, in the middle of the day. Rain was drumming against the roof, a gentle, steady rhythm that enclosed them in their small world. He had come in from the barn, his hands smelling of hay and leather. She was kneading dough, a smudge of flour on her jawline. He had been watching her for a moment, filled with a tenderness so profound it was a physical ache in his chest. He walked over to her, and with a touch as light as a whisper, he gently brushed the flour from her skin with his thumb. She stilled, her hands frozen in the dough. She looked up at him, her lips slightly parted. The air crackled with unspoken want. He did not move, did not press his advantage. He waited. It was she who initiated it. She leaned up, a small, courageous movement, and pressed her lips to his. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, chaste yet earth-shatteringly intimate. It tasted of flower and rain, and a longing that had been simmering for months. When they broke apart, they simply looked at each other, their breath mingling in the cool air. No words were necessary. They had crossed a new threshold, not with a sudden rush, but with a careful, consensual step. Their love story was being written not in grand chapters, but in these quiet, accumulated moments of micro-intimacy, each one a testament to the trust they had so carefully built. It was a love that honored her autonomy, a desire rooted in respect, and it was more powerful than any storm. The day Elias sold the small carved bird, he sealed their future. It was a simple whittling he'd made years ago during a lonely winter, a small, rough-hewn token of a hope he hadn't even known he possessed. He had seen Eleanor admire it once, her fingers tracing its wooden wings as it sat on the mantelpiece. When a traveling merchant, known for his interest in folk art, passed through the area, Elias sold it to him. He was not a man for fancy words or poetic gestures, but he knew the language of provision, of tangible action. He took the money from the sale, a surprising sum, and rode to town. He did not buy a ring. A ring was a symbol for the outside world, a claim of ownership. He and Eleanor had no need for such things. Their vows were the quiet, daily acts of partnership. Instead, he went to the land office. He returned to the ranch at dusk. Eleanor was in the small garden she had started behind the house, humming softly as she tied up her tomato plants. She looked up as he approached, a smile touching her lips, a smile that was now just for him. He stood before her, his hat in his hands, his heart pounding a slow, steady rhythm against his ribs. He held out a folded piece of paper. "What is this?" she asked, her hands still earthy from the garden. "It's the deed to this ranch," he said, his voice steady. "I had your name added to it, alongside mine. This home, this land, it is half yours, legally, irrevocably." She stared at the paper, her eyes scanning the official script, her name written in neat ink beside his own. Elias Thorne and Eleanor Vance. Tears welled in her eyes, shining in the fading light. It was not a gesture of romance in the traditional sense. It was a gesture of profound respect. He was not just offering her his heart. He was giving her security, independence, and an equal stake in the life they were building. He was making her his partner in the eyes of the law, just as they were already partners in every other way that mattered. "Elias," she breathed, her voice thick with emotion. She didn't need to say anything more. He understood. This single piece of paper was a promise more binding than any whispered sweet nothing. It was a plain vow, written in ink, that she would never again be at the mercy of a world that had tried to diminish her. It was safety with dignity, the very thing she had been searching for all her life. That night, their love-making was a culmination of every shared silence, every careful touch, every quiet vow. It was a fade-to-black moment, not of spectacle, but of sacred privacy. The narrative centered on the moments before and after, the deliberate, tender act of him unlacing her boots, the careful unbuttoning of her dress, the feel of his warm hands on her skin, the shared breath in the dark. It was about the way he held her afterward, his body a warm, protective shield around hers, the way she washed the ink of his day's work from his hands the next morning. It was about tenderness, about aftercare, about the deep, abiding peace of a chosen devotion. They had found their home, not in the wooden structure of the house, but in the shelter they had built in each other. Their found family was complete, a unit of two, sealed not with a ring, but with a shared deed and the quiet promise of every sunrise to come. Their life together settled into a rhythm as steady and comforting as a heartbeat. The house, once a bastion of solitude, was now a vessel of shared existence. It was a home named not by a sign over the door, but by the way his gaze would find her across a room, by the way she knew, without asking, just how he took his coffee. The routines that had once underscored his loneliness now became the framework of their partnership. The mornings were for him, for the hard physical labor of the ranch, but he no longer rode out into a silent world. He rode out carrying the memory of her soft breath against his neck. The afternoons were for her, for the domestic alchemy of turning flour into bread, herbs into healing salves, but her work was no longer a solitary chore. It was an act of care for the small, precious world they had built, Their love lived in the quietest of gestures. It was in the way he'd carve a new, more comfortable handle for her favorite skillet. It was in the way she'd leave a jar of cool water by the barn door on a hot day. It was in the mending of a shirt, the planting of a garden, the simple, profound act of feeding each other in the kitchen's lamplight after a long day. This was their chosen future, not a grand adventure, but a tapestry woven from 1,000 threads of ordinary devotion. The lonely, stoic protector had found his belonging not in guarding against the world, but in opening his home to one person. The proud, resilient survivor had found her safety not in building walls, but in allowing one person to see past them. Their story was a quiet one, a testament to the fact that the most traumatic romance is not one of peril, but one of proximity, where trust is the greatest treasure, and the most intimate vow is the simple, unspoken promise to stay.